There are men who rule entire cities from the shadows. Men whose names are whispered in back alleys and boardrooms with equal measures of fear and reverence. Men who have never once in their adult lives been told no. Not by judges, not by politicians, not by rivals with guns pointed at their foreheads. Dominic Reyes was exactly that kind of man. And yet, on a Tuesday night in the middle of November, in a half-empty diner on the edge of a city that owed him everything, he sat completely alone, hollow, broken, and more lost than any man his enemies could ever imagine him being. Before we dive deeper into the story, tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Dominic had built his empire the way most men of his nature do, through patience, calculated violence, and an almost supernatural ability to read people. Born in the back streets of East Carino, a city that smelled of diesel, broken promises, and old money that never reached the right hands, he had clawed his way up from nothing. His father had been a street-level enforcer, nothing more than muscle for a mid-tier syndicate that dissolved before Dominic turned 15. His mother had worked 2 jobs and died of exhaustion before she ever saw her son become anything. What Dominic became, he became alone. By 32, he controlled the docks, the construction contracts, 3 city council members, and a private security firm that was really just his soldiers in better uniforms. By 38, the Reyes name was untouchable. But power, as it turns out, has a quiet and devastating cost. And Dominic had been paying it for years without realizing the debt was accumulating interest. It started after the accident. 18 months earlier, during what was supposed to be a routine confrontation with a rival faction near the northern warehouse district, a car bomb had detonated prematurely. Dominic had survived, barely, and only because his driver, a fiercely loyal man named Tomas, had thrown himself between Dominic and the initial blast. Tomas had not survived. The explosion left Dominic with shrapnel wounds along his left side, a partially collapsed lung that had been surgically repaired, and something else. Something the doctors described in careful, clinical language that Dominic had not been prepared to absorb. Nerve damage. Significant. Possibly permanent. The kind that visited the most private corners of a man's identity and dismantled them without mercy. He had not spoken of it to anyone. Not to his inner circle, not to the woman he had been seeing at the time, a socialite named Celeste who had stopped calling after the 3rd canceled dinner, perhaps sensing that the version of Dominic she had been drawn to was no longer fully present. He had buried it the way he buried everything uncomfortable, under work, under silence, under the performance of a man who remained in total control at all times. But the silence had grown heavier with each passing month. There is a particular kind of loneliness that visits men who are feared by everyone and known by no one. Dominic Reyes lived inside that loneliness like it was a fortress he had built himself and then forgotten the exit of. His days were operationally full and personally devastated. He attended meetings, made decisions, moved money, managed threats. He ate alone. He slept alone. He sat in his penthouse above the city he controlled and felt absolutely nothing connect. The diner was an accident. Or at least that was what he told himself that first night. He had been driven past it 100 times. A small, glowing rectangle of warm light on the corner of Marsh and 11th, sandwiched between a closed pawnshop and a laundromat that was open until 2 in the morning. It was called Clara's. Not a dramatic name. Not a place where powerful men were supposed to be seen. The kind of establishment that existed in the background of a city story, serving coffee and eggs and pie to people who needed a quiet place to exhale. His driver Marco had looked in the rearview mirror with barely concealed confusion when Dominic told him to stop, but said nothing. Marco had worked for Dominic for 11 years. He had learned that questions were not always welcome. Dominic walked inside alone. He told Marco to wait. The interior was exactly what you would expect. Worn vinyl booths in a faded burgundy. A long counter with chrome stools. A glass case near the register displaying 3 types of pie that had seen better hours. The fluorescent light over the far booth was flickering. A ceiling fan turned slowly despite the November cold. There were 4 other customers. An elderly man with a newspaper. A young couple sharing something fried and laughing quietly. And a truck driver at the counter staring into his coffee like it held an answer he was waiting for. And then there was the waitress. She moved through the diner the way water moves through a narrow channel, with purpose and without wasted motion. She was not remarkable in the way that Dominic's world typically defined remarkable. She was not glamorous. She was not dressed to be noticed. She wore the diner's standard uniform. A pale blue shirt, dark slacks, a small apron at the waist. Her dark hair pulled back with a practicality that suggested she valued function over appearance at this hour. But there was something in the quality of her attention that caught him in a way he hadn't been caught in a very long time. She listened to the elderly man with the newspaper as she refilled his coffee. Not politely, actually listened. Laughed at something he said. A real laugh, unguarded, brief and genuine. Then moved on without performing the moment. Her name tag said Elena. She came to his booth without ceremony. "What can I get you?" she asked, pulling a small notepad from her apron. She looked at him the way you look at any stranger. Clearly, neutrally, without any particular reverence or fear. Dominic realized with a mild shock that she had absolutely no idea who he was. He ordered coffee. Black. She brought it without flourish and moved on. He sat in that booth for 45 minutes. He did not check his phone. He did not conduct business. He drank 2 cups of coffee that were unremarkable in every measurable way and felt, for reasons he could not rationally explain, something in the region of his chest loosened by a fraction. When he left, he placed a $100 bill under his coffee cup and walked out without a word. He told himself he would not return. He returned the next Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that. By the 4th visit, Elena had started to recognize him. Not with the electric deference he received everywhere else in his life, but with the easy recognition of routine. "The usual?" she asked, and the simplicity of those 2 words, the normalcy embedded in them, struck him somewhere unexpectedly deep. He nodded. She brought the coffee. That night, when the diner was particularly quiet, she paused at his booth during a slow moment and said, without preamble, "You look like you're carrying something heavy." Dominic looked up at her. In 40 years of life, surrounded by people whose job it was to read him, no one had ever said that to him directly. "I'm fine," he said, the automatic armor of a lifetime clicking into place. She tilted her head slightly. "Sure," she said, in a tone that communicated she did not believe him but was not going to press. "Let me know if you need anything else." She walked away, and Dominic sat with the strange sensation of having been seen, partially, fleetingly, by someone who had absolutely nothing to gain from seeing him. He began to come more often, not just Tuesdays, Thursdays, the occasional Sunday evening. He always came late, when the diner was quiet. He always sat in the same booth. He always ordered the same coffee. And gradually, the way a river gradually changes the shape of the bank it runs alongside, something between them began to form. Not romance, not yet, but something more foundational than that. Conversation. Real conversation, of the kind that Dominic had not had since before power had made genuine honesty a liability. He learned that Elena was 34, that she had a 7-year-old son named Matteo who was, by her description, equal parts brilliant and exhausting. That she had moved to Carino from a smaller city 2 years ago, following a divorce from a man she described only as someone who meant well but never grew up. That she worked the late shift because the pay differential helped with Matteo's school fees, and because her neighbor Mrs. Pacheco, a retired schoolteacher with insomnia, was happy to stay with the boy during late hours. That Elena had once studied literature at a university she had to leave when her mother fell ill, and that she still read voraciously on her breaks. He had seen the paperbacks, always slightly crinkled, tucked into her apron pocket. He did not tell her who he was. Not in the way that mattered. He said his name was Dom. He said he worked in real estate. It was technically not a complete lie. The Reyes organization owned considerable property across the city. She accepted this without particular interest, which he found, against all reason, refreshing. What he did not anticipate was the effect these visits would have on the internal wreckage he had been managing alone. There was something in Elena's complete ordinariness, her realness, her humor, her unsentimental kindness, that had begun to work on him the way warmth works on frozen ground. Slowly, invisibly, but undeniably, he started sleeping better. His appetite returned. He noticed, during board meetings and enforcer briefings, that he was sharper than he had been in months. His second in command, a careful and perceptive man named Victor, remarked during one such meeting that Dominic seemed like himself again. Dominic did not explain why. It was on a particularly cold November night, 6 weeks after that first accidental visit, that everything shifted. Elena's shift that night had clearly been brutal. He could see it in the set of her shoulders when she came to his booth, not collapsed because she was not the collapsing kind, but held with the particular tension of someone who had been managing too much for too many consecutive hours. He noticed immediately a cut on her left hand, bandaged with a strip of napkin and medical tape, suggesting a broken glass at some point during the rush. A shadow behind her eyes that hadn't been there before. He waited until the diner had emptied. Then he asked, simply, "What happened tonight?" She looked at him for a moment, weighing something he could tell. Then she sat down across from him. Not something she normally did. She told him that she had received a call from Mateo's school that afternoon, that his teacher had flagged concerning behavior. The boy had been in 2 fights in the past week, had become withdrawn in class, and had told a counselor that he was scared at home. Not of Elena. She was clear about that, and there was a fierce, quiet dignity in how she said it. Scared of the neighborhood. Of the man 2 floors below them who sold things out of his apartment at all hours and had started watching Mateo in a way that made the boy uncomfortable. Of the sounds at night. Of feeling unsafe in the only home they currently had. She said it without asking for anything. Elena was not a woman who asked for things easily. She said it the way someone releases something they have been holding, not to transfer the weight, just to set it down briefly in the presence of someone who seemed capable of understanding weight. Dominic listened to every word. He said nothing for a long moment after she finished. Then he asked for the address of her building. Just the address. His voice was level. She looked at him carefully. "Why?" "Because I know people," he said quietly, "who can make sure that man stops being a problem." The air between them changed. She was not naive. She had grown up in cities with edges. She looked at him, really looked at him, and something in his face in that moment was not the face of a man who worked in real estate. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Who are you, Dom?" But he also began to change in ways that were visible to everyone around him. Victor noticed first. "You've been different," he said one afternoon, in the direct way that only men who have known you for decades can manage. "More patient. More here." Dominic neither confirmed nor denied. But Victor was right. The hollowness that had been expanding inside him for 18 months had begun, gradually and then with increasing momentum, to fill, not with the old familiar composite of ambition and adrenaline and carefully managed threat, but with something quieter and more durable. He was sleeping. He was eating. He was laughing occasionally. A sound that made his entire staff quietly exchange glances, because it had been a long time. He also, in the privacy of these months, began to speak to a doctor, a specialist, discreet, recommended through a channel that guaranteed absolute confidentiality. He did this not because Elena had asked him to, or even suggested it. He did it because something in him had decided, for the first time in 18 months, that he was worth the effort of recovery. The nerve damage was significant, the doctor confirmed, but not without potential. There were treatments. Longer timelines than he would prefer, but real possibilities. He pursued them methodically and without fanfare, the way he pursued everything that required sustained commitment. The evening that something irrevocably shifted between them arrived, as such evenings usually do, without announcing itself. It was a Sunday. The diner was unusually quiet. Elena had brought something from home, a small container of food she had made, and she offered him some with the casual ease of someone who has stopped performing at you and started simply being near you. They ate together at the counter and talked for 3 hours, and at some point during those 3 hours the conversation moved through every surface topic and arrived at something underneath. She asked him if he had ever considered leaving it, the life, the organization, everything it represented. He was quiet for a long moment. "I've thought about what it would mean," he said carefully. "Not leaving, not simply. An exit from this world doesn't work the way a resignation does." "I know," she said. "But I've been thinking," he continued, "about what I would build if I were building for different reasons. Not territory. Not fear. Something that actually produced something. She looked at him. What would that look like? It was the question that opened a conversation that lasted until the diner closed, and continued in the parking lot, and was still unfinished when he finally got back in the car at nearly 2 in the morning, Marco awake and uncomplaining in the driver's seat. It was the conversation that contained the beginning of a plan, loose, impractical in places, genuine in ways that no plan Dominic had made in years had been genuine. It involved legitimate real estate development in East Carino, the neighborhood he came from. It involved funding for the school Matteo attended. It involved a version of himself that he had not yet become but could now, for the first time, actually see. Victor told him, when Dominic began quietly redirecting certain resources and initiating certain conversations with city officials about development contracts, that he seemed to have found something worth protecting. Dominic did not disagree. Elena, for her part, did not save Dominic Reyes in the way that stories sometimes suggest a woman saves a man, through sacrifice or moral instruction or the redemptive power of beauty. That is not what happened between them. What happened was more honest and more rare than that. She simply refused to pretend, in his presence, that he was anything other than what he was, and in that refusal created the only space in his life where he was required to do the same. She held up a clear surface, and what he saw in it, gradually and then unmistakably, was a man who had more to offer the world than fear. On a Thursday evening in late February, nearly 4 months after that first accidental visit, Dominic arrived at the diner later than usual. Elena was finishing the last of her closing tasks, wiping down the counter, moving with the particular tiredness of someone at the end of a long shift. She looked up when he came in and smiled, the easy, real smile of someone genuinely glad to see a specific person. Not a role, not a reputation, not a resource. Just a person. He sat at the counter. She poured him coffee without being asked. They were quiet together for a few minutes in the comfortable way that requires a particular kind of trust. Then Matteo, who was not supposed to be there but had been brought in by Mrs. Pacheco after a heating issue in the apartment, appeared from the back booth where he had apparently been attempting to sleep. He was 7 years old and looked exactly like his mother, dark-eyed, serious, with an air of evaluating everything he encountered with scientific precision. He looked at Dominic without any of the complicated adult awareness that surrounded Dominic in every other room he inhabited. He looked at him the way a child looks at a new adult, with uncomplicated curiosity. "You're the man who fixed the lights on our stairs," Matteo said. Dominic looked at Elena. She raised an eyebrow slightly. "I heard Mama on the phone," Matteo explained without any shame. "She said the man from the diner got the lights fixed." He paused, considering. "Our building is safer now." Dominic looked at this small, serious person and felt something move through him that was completely unlike anything in his catalog of known feelings. "I'm glad," he said simply. Matteo nodded, satisfied, and climbed back into the booth to continue his interrupted sleep. Elena was watching Dominic when he turned back. Her expression was quiet and warm and completely unguarded. "He remembers everything," she said softly. "Every kindness." A pause. "So do I." The city of Carino did not change overnight. Men like Dominic Reyes do not simply step out of what they have built without consequence, and the process of disentanglement, conducted over months carefully with the kind of strategic patience that had built the empire in the first place now being applied to the construction of an exit, was slow and complex and occasionally dangerous in ways that required navigation. Victor managed most of the transition internally. There were conversations with men who needed to understand that the shift in direction was not a weakness to exploit but a line not to cross. There were a few such conversations that were less pleasant than others. But the development project in East Carino broke ground in the spring. 3 blocks of affordable housing with a community center at its base, built on land that Dominic had quietly been acquiring for 2 years, now redirected towards something his mother might have recognized as worth the cost. The school near Elena's apartment received an anonymous endowment, structured properly legally through a foundation established by a lawyer Dominic had retained for the purpose. Matteo's class, along with 11 others, would be the first beneficiaries. Dominic did not attend the groundbreaking ceremony in any public capacity. He stood at a distance and watched the machinery break the earth of the neighborhood he had grown up in, and felt something he had no word for, something between grief and possibility, the particular feeling of finally being pointed in the right direction after years of traveling fast but wrong. Elena stood beside him. She had brought coffee in a thermos from the diner. She handed him a cup and they stood together in the cold spring morning watching the ground open. "Is this real?" he asked. Not performatively. He was actually asking. She looked at the construction site, then at him. "Feels like it," she said. He had been told by a doctor 3 weeks earlier that the treatments were producing measurable results. That the nerve damage, while it would never fully reverse, had responded better than the initial prognosis had suggested. That patience and consistent care and, as the doctor had phrased it with a clinical delicacy, a reduction in sustained psychological stress, had made a genuine difference. Dominic had sat in that clean, quiet office and absorbed this information and thought of Elena's diner, of the flickering fluorescent light, of 2 cups of coffee and a woman who had looked at him clearly and refused to look away. There are men who rule entire cities from the shadows. And there are moments when the shadow itself becomes unbearable. When a man who has spent his life building walls around himself sits in a half-empty diner at the end of a Tuesday and is, against all reasonable expectation, found. Not rescued. Not reformed by the power of someone else's goodness. But found. Seen. Returned to a version of himself that had been present all along, buried under the weight of who he had decided, a long time ago out of necessity and then later out of habit, to be. Dominic Reyes had lost more than he had let himself admit in that warehouse explosion. He had lost the illusion that power and control were the same thing as being whole. He had lost Tomas, and had never properly grieved him. He had lost the ability to believe that anything he could not directly manage was safe. And he had lost, in the clinical language of nerve damage and surgical reconstruction, a part of his physical identity that had quietly destroyed something in him that no rival or setback ever had. What he found in a diner on the corner of Marsh and 11th was not a cure. It was not a miracle or a romance or a redemption arc with clean edges. What he found was a woman who poured honest coffee and told hard truths and laughed without performing it and loved her son with a ferocity that reminded him, every time he witnessed it, that the strongest force in any human life is not fear. It is the refusal to stop caring. He put the coffee cup to his lips. The spring air was cold and smelled of turned earth and diesel and the particular optimism of construction. The machinery moved across the ground of East Carino, and Dominic Reyes stood in the neighborhood he had come from and felt, with something approaching certainty, that he was finally building something worth the cost. Elena's hand found his in the cold. He held it, not with the grip of a man who controls things, with the grip of a man who has finally found something worth holding.